After 9 months of fighting, a new birth for Mosul. Iraq's leader declares victory over Daesh, but how will the government now deal with the challenge of rebuilding? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. They were triumphant scenes, a long time coming, as Iraq's Prime Minister toured Mosul to announce its liberation from Daesh. And it's a victory that's come at a huge cost. What was once a thriving city is now a devastated shell. Thousands have been killed and around 1 million displaced. And the fight against Daesh is not over, with several Iraqi towns still under their control. While this defeat is undoubtedly a major blow for the terror group, is it more symbolic than strategic? As the fight and the world's focus now moves elsewhere, what will the future hold for Mosul? The UN estimates it'll cost at least $1 billion to rebuild the roads and restore clean running water and electricity to the city. And many wonder whether the battle has exposed or even exacerbated sectarian fault lines. How will the city's underlying grievances be addressed? And what will be done to stop the return of Daesh? For all of Abadi's bravado, there's been no recognition that he and his forces bear some responsibility for losing control of the city in the first place.
In honesty, I've come to Mosul today to follow up on our victories and the eradication of Daesh, which we are in the final moments of doing. Daesh fighters have chosen to be besieged because they had been given two options in the past: surrender or death. Most of them chose to die. They didn't choose surrender, except a small number, but others were killed. We have no other option for Daesh fighters if they don't surrender besides death, and we have done that. Most Daesh fighters in Mosul have been killed, and what we have left now is a small number. I will leave some room for the heroic armed forces to complete this action, so we can announce victory soon, God willing.
Well, to discuss all this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Ismail al-Sudani. He's a retired Brigadier General with the Iraqi army and also a former Iraqi defense attaché to the United States. So thank you very much for joining us. How important is this moment for you?
For me, it's very important because Iraqi army has successfully liberated Mosul, the strategic or the monumental city for the caliphate when they claimed their caliphate back in June 2014. And that's really significant for everybody in Iraq because what has happened in June 2014 was really desperate and makes the nation on the brink of the collapse. And restoring the confidence on the Iraqi security forces to rely on itself with the help of the coalition and the other nations to kick ISIS out of the Iraqi territories completely. Although this is not the final phase to eradicate ISIS, in my perspective, ISIS will stay longer than after liberating Mosul because the most important phase is the government should have prepared multi-pronged strategies to follow up and pursue Daesh or ISIS in their hideouts and the places where they came from.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of the root causes in a few minutes. But first of all, let me once again sort of just reiterate the point that this was the same army that 3 years ago dropped their weapons and ran, essentially. I mean, many of them were also terribly brutally executed by Daesh when Daesh had overrun Iraqi towns and cities 3 summers ago. So tell me, what was the major difference in this Iraqi army-led operation between this one and the one 3 years ago that ran away when Daesh came? And Daesh wasn't very strong back then, when they came and took over and these guys abandoned their posts. What's the main difference?
In my perspective, there is no main differences, in fact, but I think the circumstances now is different. the same security forces who were controlling on the cities in Iraq were subjected to bad propaganda from the political parties, some regional powers, to discredit the Iraqi security forces and create a gap between the population and the Iraqi security forces. Therefore, Iraqi security forces looks like they were operating in a very hostile areas like Mosul, Tikrit, or Ramadi, and they were unwelcomed by the population. Now, after the population have seen the horrendous treatment of Daesh, they realized that thus Daesh wasn't, or those terrorist groups are not representing them, and they are treating them very bad, and therefore they needed to be liberated by the Iraqi security forces. Yes, it was a collapse. It was really, I could say, a domino collapse effects for the Iraqi security forces at that time. But restoring the capabilities and building the capabilities was, a needed time to restore the confidence in themselves, restore the confidence of the population on the Iraqi security forces. Otherwise, the federal police, the Iraqi army divisions, the counterterrorism forces, Peshmerga, all of them are alike, the same elements who were at 2014, who fought today in Mosul.
Mm-hmm. Now, undoubtedly, this is a brutal enemy. Just over the weekend, we saw pictures of a woman cradling a baby who then blew herself up and killed those who were coming into Mosul trying to liberate the city, as well as other civilians surrounding her. Daesh is egregious. It is disgusting. It fits many definitions of evil for many people. But on the other side of the coin, many civilians were also killed in this operation, from the air and on the ground. Does it sadden you that so many innocent civilians were killed in this operation to oust Daesh from Mosul?
Yes, I just want to reiterate and emphasize on one reality. Daesh wasn't designed to capture the ground for a long time and establish their own state to be recognized by the international community. And therefore, it was initially, from the beginning, and basically was expected that ISIS will be removed and will be not survived for a long time. And many expected that it would be earlier than three years to stay in Mosul or in Ramadi or other areas in Iraq. But because of the political dispute in the region, it's between the world powers and the regional powers on the status or the end state of the Syrian presidency, was giving them a chance, an opportunity to stay longer than expected. However, ISIS also, from this war, has accomplished what they intended in fact, the huge destruction, the casualties that have been inflicted on the civilians and the Iraqi security forces, the losses and the casualties and the damages and the cities that they have controlled. It's really also magnificent, and that needed attention from the Iraqi government as well as the international community to restore everything in order to completely eradicate ISIS. Is not only achieve the military victory over ISIS. It needs multiple efforts, multiple strategies and support to complete the mission. It's counter the ideology is part of that strategy. Counter the flowing the money and recruiting to this horrendous.
So allow me to come in there.
Also required.
Yeah. Okay. So you can bomb or kill fighters, but it's more difficult to bomb or kill a bad idea, and that bad idea continues to generate itself. When people are squeezed or oppressed, they're easier to recruit, right? Now, I want to go into some of Iraq's recent history. We have Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Der Spiegel reports. Even the Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, has criticized Shia militias and others with a sectarian bent within the Iraqi security forces who have hurt, who have killed, who have injured, who have humiliated many innocent Sunni civilians. Do you believe that the Iraqi system right now, the government and the security forces, actually have a plan to ensure that this doesn't repeat itself over and over again, because there seems to be a sectarianism built into the authority at the moment that's generating a lot of terrorism? Would you agree with that?
I really would like to draw your attention and everybody's attention that Iraqi government is, or Iraq as a whole, configured as specified as a fragile state, and government cannot control on each and every part of the country, and they cannot make oversee also every part of the country, and therefore it's the fragility of the government to impose order, law. It's also part of what I am, bringing on the table.
Okay, but then let me come in there, right, and tell you that when I spoke to Iraqi lawmaker Saad al-Muttalibi, so this is not somebody who has good intentions, who's saying that he's trying to impose some sort of law and order, but they can't control militias, right? When I interviewed him about Daesh, he said, when we catch a member of Daesh, when we catch someone on the battlefield, we kill them. This is what he told me on this very program, right? So these were suspects. These weren't people that you arrest and you try. He was talking about executing suspects, right? And he laughed about it when I asked if this was contravening the Geneva Conventions. So again, I'm asking you, is there an attitude that might down the line make things worse and lead to the rise of things that are far worse than Daesh, maybe?
Umran, we are an Eastern conservative, tribal society, and you understand what I mean. That there are many people now in Mosul, inside Mosul, who has been tortured, who has been killed. Their families are now looking for ISIS or Daesh elements to revenge from them. And that's, you cannot control if the government has no power on each and every part, has no system to control on this kind of, individual acts. It's really going to be very tough on the Iraqi government to restore the orders and, try every, fighter and every soldier who has committed a crime against humanity, or because it's at the end of the day, it's not a systematic violation to the law, because it's a soldier in the operation in the battlefield is subjected to the emotional effects, and that's really the cornerstone on how we need professional, good training forces to treat the civilians. The second issue which I feel that it's a huge challenge in front of the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government is the uncontrolled weapons, the uncontrolled groups who are not, subjected to or submitted to the Iraqi government, and they don't want to be part of the Iraqi security forces. That what you call the Shia militias. In fact, some of them, if you say that we have to distinguish between the Hashd al-Shabi, which are totally submitted to the Iraqi government, and those groups who do not want to be part of the Iraqi government. Or they would, pretend they are part of the Iraqi government. So Iraqi government will have lots of challenges in the front. How they will, tackle this kind of challenges, this is the question in front of the Iraq government. I don't think so Iraq government is capable by itself to tackle this challenge. They need the international community to support. They need regional powers to understand stability, security of Iraq is part of their stability and security.
Retired Brigadier General in the Iraqi Army, Ismail Sudani, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Imran.
Everyone says it would be one of the most catastrophic conflicts in living memory, a nuclear war with North Korea. And yet the US seems to be taking steps in that direction. Washington says it will use the full range of capabilities at their disposal against the growing threat. That includes the possibility of military force. It comes after Pyongyang's launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile last week that could reportedly hit America. So how likely is it that the war of words will become more than that? Diplomacy and sanctions don't seem to have worked, so is a military option the next logical step? Natalie Pohonen reports.
How do you solve a problem like North Korea? That's the dilemma facing US President Donald Trump.
We must also confront the threat from North Korea, and that's what it is. It's a threat. We're also talking, obviously, about North Korea and the problem and menace of North Korea.
Trump has also turned reining in Pyongyang's nuclear weapons program into one of the most critical issues in the US relationship with China.
I appreciate the things that you have done relative to the very substantial problem that we all face in North Korea, a problem that something has to be done about.
The US approach so far has focused on increasing economic sanctions and centering Pyongyang diplomatically. But the North Korean leader Kim Jong Un's response to that war of words has been a show of force. This month's successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile was heralded in North Korea as a great demonstration of the nation's power and its ability to defend itself. Despite decades of sanctions meant to prevent this kind of test, the regime has shown its ability to work around such barriers. Some experts believe it's now capable of launching a missile which could strike the US mainland. Pyongyang says this type of weapon is also capable of carrying a large and heavy nuclear warhead. Trump is not the first US president to try to limit North Korea's nuclear capabilities, but he has made it a centerpiece of his US foreign policy. And American forces have been quick to respond to Pyongyang's displays of military might with their own. Last week, the US sent 2 supersonic bombers from Guam to take part in a drill with South Korean forces. The mission of their simulation, destroying an enemy's ballistic missile launcher. Now that Pyongyang has shown it could potentially hit US soil, questions are being asked about whether the US needs to take a more active strategy.
Do we need to shoot down their next missile? What's the next move?
You know, I trust our military. I trust this president for letting the military do their job. They're not going to advertise what they're going to do beforehand. But, Pete, this is an existential threat to this nation.
Donald Trump says there will eventually be success on the North Korean issue. He hasn't defined what success will look like, but he also hasn't ruled out taking direct military action. So should that be an option worth considering? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by US syndicated radio host John Cardillo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and from Beijing, Chinese affairs analyst Einar Tangen. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. John Cardillo, let me begin with you. Is North Korea a rational actor?
No, not at all. They're not a rational actor whatsoever. I think that's evident in Kim's daily behavior. And that's the limited information that comes out of North Korea. I mean, think about it. They tightly censor what comes out of that nation in terms of media, and he still comes off looking like a world-class lunatic. And so I think he's anything but a rational actor. I think he's quite irrational and needs to be deposed as quickly as possible.
Einar Tangen, is North Korea a rational actor?
Well, some people say that he is, and that he's similar to Donald Trump, and that he likes to create a lot of commotion, create confrontation, and things like that. So you have two very similar people in the sense of their styles who are going at it. Unfortunately, from the U.S. side, yes, we do not see him as rational because of his desire to have a nuclear-armed ICBM pointed at the U.S. while he's spewing vitriolic anti-American sayings.
John Cardillo, how would you have him deposed without risking military confrontation, without risking nuclear annihilation?
Let me first make let me just counter my colleague's point. He's nothing like Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, the American president, doesn't starve his own people and murder his senior staff. It's a ridiculous comparison. They're nothing alike. Trump isn't a homicidal maniac. But that being said, I don't think there's a way to depose this guy without killing him, quite frankly. It's as simple as that. I think there's going to have to be military action or some kind of intelligence operation, at least, to remove him, to exterminate him, use whatever term you'd like to use. I think that China has to be a partner in this for the simple reason that the United States has very little, if any, effective human intelligence on the ground in North Korea. So we're going to rely. We need China's help in this, but I don't know if China really wants a unified Korea on their southern border.
Okay, I'm glad you both brought up Trump and China, because there's a tweet for everything, of course, in this presidency. Trump tweeted, trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. There's the text of the tweet on your screen. Einar Tangen, is that unfair on the Chinese?
No, it's neither fair nor unfair. It reflects the reality. From the Chinese perspective, they're trying to create a non-lethal trade with North Korea to show them that there is an alternative. What we have right now is, at best, a slow-motion train wreck. The U.S. will not let a nuclear-armed ICBM be pointed at the U.S., and North Korea will not give up its nuclear program unless it gets absolute assurances of its safety. So at this point, neither is able to come to resolution. China and now South Korea are in between. It is going to be a situation which impacts them more than the U.S. if there is, in fact, some operation to try to remove Kim or start a military attack. Remember, 1/4 of South Korea's population is within range of artillery. This has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. This is a barrage that could take out millions of people. And sitting in the U.S., it is sometimes very easy to say that that is the price of our protection. But I'm sure the South Koreans would disagree.
Yep.
For China's perspective, they would be looking at a horde of refugees streaming across the border in the ensuing mayhem that would arise as
isn't that a bit of a
different factions fought for control.
Sure, isn't that a bit of a cop-out? And I've been hearing this for years, that the Chinese don't want a string of refugees across the border. That's why they're willing to prop up the North Koreans for as long as possible. Is it worth maintaining this totalitarian dictatorship next door just because you don't want refugees across the border?
Well, that's a fairly loaded question. You're saying that China is propping them up. But the issue is, if they withdraw all support, what would you have? You'd have a complete breakdown in that particular society.
They're propping up the survival of the Kim dynasty.
Trade is. Well, the survival of the Kim dynasty is there. We cannot change that. They are sitting in the seat of power. As we have seen in other places where we thought it would be very, very easy to come in and transition the governments in Iraq, it does not work out the way that you plan. And the people who get killed are not necessarily Americans to begin with, unless they go in directly, but it's the civilian populations who pay the price.
Okay.
So it's very easy to sit when you're not involved directly and say, look, this is just something we should do for the safety of ourselves.
Okay, so let's ask John Cardillo. John, you're in Fort Lauderdale. You're not within the range of North Korean missiles, whether nuclear or not. It's very easy to be hawkish over there. But the Chinese, they have to live in the neighborhood. The South Koreans have to be in the same neighborhood as well. Isn't it easy for you to be a hawk while the rest of them have to deal with the consequences?
Well, look, I don't ever make these statements lightly. I have plenty of friends serving in the military. I was with the NYPD. I lost friends on 9/11. So I understand the price of attacks and war. But this is not analogous to Iraq. In Iraq, you had Islamofascist insurgencies who wanted to fill the vacuum created when we toppled Saddam Hussein. You don't have that in North Korea. The people in North Korea are oppressed. They are being murdered. They are being starved. They want this maniac gone. And we can't let despots, we cannot let homicidal maniac despots rule and threaten the world with nuclear weapons because they might strike a city in South Korea. Now, that being said, again, our intelligence assets, both signals and human intelligence, are very limited. So we have to be very careful about what we do. But I do think that inevitably a surgical strike to kill Kim and an intelligence operation to replace him with somebody more rational and more pro-global trade, who's not going to want to arm themselves with nuclear weapons and threaten all their neighbors in the international community, that's going to have to happen. Again, that's inevitable, because this guy cannot continue to sit there in his little pocket of the world between China, between Korea, and threaten everyone. But I do agree that China does not want the refugees. China also doesn't want an expanded South Korea economic base. They rely on their factories that pump out U.S. goods. They don't want our relationship on that front with South Korea to grow when a unified Korea becomes more productive and more of an industrialized society. So I understand China's problem, but we're at a point now where we've got to put some pressure on them economically and say, hey, we can move those factories to South Korea tomorrow if you're not going to assist us in removing this guy. I think the time is long past for soft diplomacy with North Korea.
Okay, so Einat Tangen, this is not just John Cardillo's view, but it's a view that seems to be prevalent and gaining more ground in the U.S. right now. It's not nuclear war with the North Koreans. It's not attacking them. It's just assassinating Kim Jong Un, and everything will sort of turn out okay. How do you see that, Einar?
Well, if it was that simple, I think it would have been done quite a while ago. I mean, this is not a situation where you just dance in and know where he is. He uses body doubles. He is prepared for this. He's quite aware that a decapitation strike is one of the options that's on there. If you think he's not prepared for this, I think you're highly deluded. Once again, wrapping yourself in the flag does not, and making allusions to 9/11 does nothing to do with the current crisis in hand. The people who are going to suffer, and there's no ambiguity about the 6,000 plus artillery pieces pointed at Seoul, where in the greater Seoul area, there, as I said, 1/4 of the entire population of South Korea. As to your illusions that somehow China is trying to prevent a unified Korean peninsula because it would be to their benefit, do you think really that they're very pleased that every time Xi Jinping gets near a microphone, wants to make a major policy speech, Kim Jong Un sees it fit to fire off another one of his missiles as a show of contempt for Beijing? I think it's very, very strange that there's this prevalent view within the U.S. that Beijing is somehow happy with the situation in North Korea. They would like nothing better than to have trade. Remember, they are the ones who are pushing the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to keep globalization alive. It is Donald Trump who is on the other end of that equation, who says, no, America first. It's resulted in us being isolated, as is shown in the G20, and this kind of behavior and simplistic thinking is a kind of problem that everybody can buy into, but will result in greater calamity thereafter.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately we've run out of time, but I'd love to have both of you on the program again in the future. Thanks so much for joining us, John Cardillo and Einar Tangen. Still to come on the Newsmakers, deep divisions in Hamburg. The US goes it alone at the G20 summit, while activists and anarchists clash with police. We have a special report from Germany. And also ahead, from the capital all the way to Istanbul, we look at the Turkish opposition's march for justice. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. From climate change to trade, the US under President Donald Trump seems to be increasingly going it alone in the international community. That was clear over the weekend at the meeting of the world's 20 largest economies. Trump's approach at the G20 also provided one of the starkest contrasts between him and his predecessor, President Barack Obama, who bore responsibility for global leadership. But to Trump supporters, the president is simply fulfilling his promises. But is this just America first or America increasingly isolated? Yvette McCullough has this report from the summit in Hamburg.
The annual meeting of G20 leaders descended on Hamburg to discuss security, climate, trade and development against a backdrop of a bitter family feud, sideline meetings, mass protests and very low expectations.
Natürlich werden wir auch auf der anderen Seite Dissens nicht übertünchen, sondern Dissens auch benennen, denn es gibt zu einigen wichtigen Fragen auch unterschiedliche Meinungen.
The stage for this year's G20 is quite different to recent years, not being held in a remote area, but in a major city, and one that has a strong history of passionate protest. Not only that, this picturesque port town is a symbol of Angela Merkel's strong stance on free trade. Along with climate change, free trade was set as one of the main agendas for the summit by the German host, a direct challenge to US President Donald Trump, as the G20 for the first time dealt with the reality of Trump's America First policies.
There's a lot of disagreement on particular issues that used to be a no-brainer for the G20. Climate change, anti-protectionism, year after year we always see those commitments on the agenda. It's quite unusual that we have to spend so much time looking at something that almost everyone agrees on.
But the top of Trump's agenda seemed to be his first face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The much-anticipated rendezvous was scheduled during the working group on climate change and ran well over time.
Well, we've had some very, very good talks.
Drawing much of the world media's attention, it raised concern that sideline issues and disagreements would overshadow or be used as a scapegoat for the G20 failing to make real progress.
We don't have the luxury of being cynical or giving up hope. This is a question of global leadership. So there's always going to be dissension, there's always going to be differences of opinion between leaders. It's not fair to point at one particular leader and blame them for a lack of results.
A tens of thousands strong welcoming party for the G20. Protesters coming from around the world to deliver a loud message to leaders that they need to do more to tackle climate change and inequality and to end conflicts.
So what brought you here today? We are here today to show our leaders that we disagree with their politics and we want other positive politics for people, planet.
To protest against the capitalist system that is destroying the world bit by bit.
It's the biggest thing to discuss on this moment, and they're busy with other things.
But these peaceful demonstrations had a dark side, with violence throughout the city over the weekend. German police called in extra reinforcements and used water cannon and tear gas to disperse crowds. Protesters made barricades and threw rocks and bottles. Dozens of police officers were injured, as at night protesters set fire to property and cars and looted shops. An aggressive and at times vicious display of anti-capitalism. Inside the summit, opposition and dissent were also playing out. The final statement was delayed due to disagreements with the US over the wording on the Paris Accord. The end result? A statement that laid bare how isolated the US has become.
Wir haben extra jetzt in der letzten Version des Kommuniqués nochmal aufgenommen, dass in dem Absatz, der die amerikanische Position beschreibt, immer deutlich wird, dass es die amerikanische Position ist, also the United States of America stellen fest, dass und insofern machen wir uns diese Position ausdrücklich nicht zu eigen.
The final communique also had a line appeasing the US on trade, adding that it needs to be fair as well as free.
The whole purpose of these groups are that you have a group of like-minded leaders coming together. You know, we've just seen them pose for a family photo. They choose the word family for a very good reason, because they're trying to give a clear message that they stand together on an issue.
With this G20 family now split on key issues, will we see mini alliances form? Or the G20 leaving the US behind?
I think that everyone else is going to continue on. They're going to want to see progress in their areas and what's important to them. They're certainly not going to wait for America to start agreeing.
The parting impression of Trump's first G20 was a clear sign that the US is stepping back from its role as global leader. But will Trump's mantra of America first result in it being America alone? Yvette McCullough in Hamburg for the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Brian Riley. He's a senior policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, where he specializes in trade at the Center for Free Markets and Regulatory Reform. And from London, Andrew Hilton. He's the director for the Center of Financial Innovation. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Andrew Hilton, let me begin with you, sir. Has the G20 become G19 plus one?
Possibly. Certainly that was how the press regarded it afterwards. I don't think that Trump actually made too many mistakes, and I don't think really that he did himself or the US any serious damage. But yes, I think there was an attempt to isolate him on trade issues, and perhaps they succeeded, and of course on climate change issues.
Brian Riley, is it Trump versus the rest now?
Well, I don't think it turned out to be that way at all. I agree with the earlier statement. Look, on climate policy, when President Trump was running for president, he said the United States is going to pull out of the Paris Accord. He got elected, and whether we could argue about whether it was good, bad, or otherwise, but he was fulfilling a campaign promise. So I don't think there should be any big surprise that the U.S. took that action. And whatever other countries need to do to respond, that's up to them. On trade policy, I think there's a difference between if the U.S. were to suddenly throw up our tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers versus saying we want to open foreign markets. And I know the rhetoric's been a little bit on one side, on the other side, but I really believe the focus from the administration is more on how do we get other countries to open their markets more, as opposed to we need to close our markets. That might be a little bit wishful thinking on my part, but I think that's the view I took coming from the G20 summit.
Brian, Trump thinks that the U.S. is hurt by free trade agreements like NAFTA, like TPP. Has there been any indication that he has a clear idea of what to replace them with?
Well, certainly trade in the United States as a leader of trade after World War II has been something that's benefited not just the global economy, but people here in the United States as well. You look at our manufacturing output, for example. Before NAFTA, it was going up. We passed NAFTA, manufacturing output kept going up. We're really a little bit in a global competition to see who can lower trade and investment barriers the most and the fastest, because it's those countries that are going to prosper. So the rhetoric certainly indicates an idea that the U.S. has been taken advantage of by other countries in trade policy. But when we actually get into these negotiations, and the North American Free Trade Agreement will be the first real indication of this, are we really going to move in a direction of modernizing the agreements to include things like digital trade that weren't around, that wasn't significant in the 1990s? Or are we going to go the direction of saying, well, we have to have a balanced trade, or we have to have a trade surplus with every country in the world? Of course, that's something that would be much more risky, much more dangerous. Right now, we just don't know. You can, I think, look at President Trump's language in the administration statement and either view them as a negotiating tactic, that if we don't get a good result, we're willing to walk away from these deals. Or you can look at it as, maybe he really thinks that the idea that we should have these trade agreements is bad for us and we should leave. Those are two separate things. It's pretty widely accepted, I believe, in the United States, both among policy leaders and the public, that these agreements have been good for the United States. So I certainly hope we don't scrap them and try and start over, but instead focus on trying to improve them. And we're in a wait-and-see mode just to find that out.
Okay, there's a lot of anxiety over steel. Andrew, I wonder what you think of this. You know, there's there's been the fear that Trump could impose new tariffs on steel imports. Some U.S. media says that that could provoke a global trade war, as it would affect trade with more than a dozen countries. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said the EU would retaliate with countermeasures. Those measures could target American whiskey imports. And Italy's Prime Minister says the US's protectionist measures could slow the world's economy. Andrew, do you share those fears?
No, I don't really see it that way. I'm inclined to agree with the other respondent here that Trump's bark is a lot worse than his bite. He's said a lot of things, he hasn't done very much, and many of the things that he has done, Obama would have done anyway, or Hillary Clinton would have done had she won, such as the restrictions on softwood imports of lumber from Canada. As for steel, yeah, there are problems. There are real problems with overproduction of steel, and that was recognized by the G20 in the communique. There is a problem with Chinese exports of steel. There is a problem with exports of steel from Europe as well. But I think this can be handled within the framework of the WTO and the wiggle room that gives importing countries to restrict imports under certain circumstances. It is a little bit scarier when you start thinking about some of the philosophical underpinnings of what Trump is talking about, because he has people who are close to him, notably Peter Navarro, but also, I guess, Wilbur Ross, who don't necessarily agree that free trade is a win-win, who do see that deals like NAFTA and some other plurilateral and multilateral arrangements have actually cost Americans jobs. There is a sort of chain of economic thinking that does suggest that we have to pay more attention now to trade imbalances than we did in the past, and that it's not axiomatic that free trade is a win-win for everything or for everybody. I think as an economist, we grew up on mother's milk believing that free trade was good for the sum of human happiness. But now we have to ask ourselves where that human happiness occurs. And is it, after all, the job of a politician to increase human happiness, say, in China or in Pittsburgh, where he was elected? So there is something going on underneath which is undermining our visceral gut reaction that all free trade is good. But as far as Trump is concerned, he's acting within the rules much, much more than he's acting outside them.
Brian, do you fear steel wars?
Well, again, so far we haven't had evidence that something's going to happen. But at some point, I think the administration, they don't want to be the boy who cried wolf, and they need to show, I'm afraid they may need to show that they're willing to take action on some of these things in order to prove that it's not just rhetoric. My hope is that this will lead us towards some kind of negotiation that with the G20 or within the WTO can address the problem. It's harder to get China to change its policies with the U.S. going it alone. It's a little bit of a silly argument, my understanding, to say that our defense in the U.S. is being harmed by steel imports when something like 2 or 3% of our steel production goes to the defense industry. So it might not be the wisest way to go about it. And with respect to trade policy, we just had a sugar agreement with Mexico. And it's a real weird deal where here in D.C., Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, it's accepted that Americans should pay twice the world price for sugar. So if you're a company that makes, say, Oreo cookies, you decide, well, I guess we'll just move down to Mexico. Or if you're a car maker, increasingly, Mexico has trade agreements with Brazil that we don't, trade agreements with the EU that we don't. And car makers are looking at those opportunities and saying, well, everything else being equal, Mexico looks like a pretty good place compared to the United States to do business. So we need to move in that direction, opening markets, not closing them. And if we were to move in the direction of closing them and putting up barriers on steel that's going to harm our car makers, that's going to harm our construction workers, that would be a big mistake.
Right. Andrew, given that Europe and Japan reached a landmark free trade agreement, Mexico and China, two of the US's largest trading partners, have been considering their own bilateral free trade agreement. Doesn't that suggest that the US is being left behind?
Well, if you look at this mysterious thing called JIPA, there's an awful lot to do before it actually comes into force. There's no agreement on the dispute resolution mechanism, for instance, and that's going to take at least a year or so to work out. And then that agreement has to be ratified by all the European parliaments. And as we know from the EU-Canada deal, that can get stuck in some very odd places. So I think people have got a little bit too enthusiastic about the EU-Japan deal. It's still by no means a done deal. However, it was a stick with which the Europeans could beat Trump at the G20 summit, and they used that to indicate that they were better on trade than he was. Well, maybe, but we will see. I think there's certainly a dangerous drift away from multilateralism to what we call plurilateralism, towards these not necessarily bilateral but plurilateral agreements. And it is assumed that that's a good thing. Of course, it isn't necessarily a good thing, and it does worry both the WTO and the IMF that we are losing the momentum behind multilateralism and resorting, if you like, to a second best in terms of plurilateral agreements. But nonetheless, it's probably the wave of the future, and there probably will be more. And the Americans will do the same sorts of deals. The Americans, for instance, after all, at the Hamburg summit, talked of doing a deal very, very quickly with the UK after it has left the European Union. And that probably is the wave of the future. In some ways, it's sad, but it is probably inevitable. Yeah, talking about the wave of the future, Brian, is it absolutely certain that while President Obama was a globalist, Donald Trump still wants America to be #1, but he doesn't really care about America leading the rest of the world? Are you comfortable with that, and is that the way forward?
Well, I'm comfortable with the kind of vision that Ronald Reagan laid out for the United States, which was more free markets, the U.S. being a leader, but not closing our markets to the world, but instead working to open global markets. And we did that through creating the World Trade Organization, an initiative that was kicked off under the Reagan administration, the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. In 1979, when President Reagan announced his run for presidency, he said we needed a North American Accord. And it's right, these regional and bilateral agreements are not ideal. I think they're better than nothing. But if you're a small business and you've got one set of rules, if let's say you're here in the United States, you got one set of rules for doing business with Mexico, another set of rules for doing business with Canada, or actually I should say for Colombia, a different set if we have an agreement with the UK or the EU or Japan. It's just really complicated, and they don't achieve their maximum impact. So my hope is that we have leadership, whether it's with global trade, and when I say global, really I'm talking about the freedom of individuals to make their own decisions. So it's something that empowers Americans, and anything we can do to move in that direction, or empowering people in other countries to make their own decisions, then we're going to be better off. If we inadvertently start throwing up barriers, and what could happen is the U.S. does a little bit here, the EU retaliates a little bit there, China retaliates a little bit, and then before you know it, we could be in a situation that nobody would consciously head towards. Yeah, and then it sort of gets me to bring this all back to the beginning, Andrew. Are we seeing maybe a lessening of the prestige or the prestigiousness of these global institutions under the Trump presidency? I think the answer to that is yes, but it's not necessarily a function of Trump. I think that there is, and there has been for some time, a drift away from multilateralism towards these bilateral or plurilateral arrangements, and that's undermined to some extent the WTO. I think the IMF has been undermined because it has drifted further and further away from its core competences. It got obsessed with Greece for a couple of years. The World Bank has ceased to be a project financing institution, and it's become very much a sort of soft touch for any kind of nutty left-wing or social program. And so a lot of the underpinnings, the Bretton Woods institutions, but more broadly the multilaterals, have been undermined by what they've actually drifted away from their core competences. So yes, I think there is a danger that the institutional underpinnings that have made, I guess, Western society so prosperous over the last 50 years are being eroded. That's a pity, but it's probably inevitable. Okay, gentlemen, it's been good to talk to you. Andrew Hilton and Brian Riley, thank you very much.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.